The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a day like any other, except for the thin white envelope with handwriting I didn't recognize. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, heavier than just a piece of paper, as if it held a secret that could somehow hurt me even before I opened it. My name was scrawled across the front, and there was no return address. It didn't seem like a bill or junk mail, so I decided to open it right there in the kitchen, with a cup of coffee that suddenly tasted bitter. The first line hit me with the kind of impact you can't brace for. Dear Allison, I've debated whether or not to write this for years, and maybe I shouldn't, but there are things I feel you deserve to know. My name is Clara, and I was once very close to your husband. My heart raced as I read those words, the room narrowing around me until all I could see were the shaky letters dancing on the paper. Clara. Clara. I didn't know a Clara, but something inside me froze as I read on, piecing together fragments of sentences and phrases I didn't want to understand. It was years ago now, a mistake that I've regretted every day since. I was naive enough to think it was love, but it was more about loneliness, something broken in both of us. The words felt like tiny daggers, each one lodging in my heart. She was apologizing, that much was clear, but it wasn't an apology meant to free me. It was an apology to ease her own guilt. I clung to each sentence, barely able to breathe as the story unfolded. She described meeting him at a conference, just the two of them sharing a drink at a hotel bar. A simple moment, really. But she had seen the distance in his eyes, the weight he carried. We were both tired of our lives in some way, she wrote. We were each seeking something we didn't have, and somehow we found it in each other. I don't say this to excuse what happened. It was wrong, I know that. But it wasn't meaningless, at least not to me. I thought you should know. My hands were shaking. I could hardly believe what I was reading. My husband had never seemed like someone who could do this, someone who could betray me so deeply. I tried to picture him at that conference, his face I knew so well, laughing with this stranger, sharing pieces of himself that I had thought were mine alone. I didn't know about you at first, she continued. I found out later, and by then I was too deep in. I know that's no excuse. And I know he chose you. But I feel you deserve the truth. Maybe so you can understand him. Maybe so you can decide what you truly want. Understand him? The irony made me want to laugh. How could I understand a man who had been hiding a whole other life from me? I didn't know this side of him, the man who could charm a stranger into his bed, who could forget his wife and family for a night of what? Excitement? Escape? She went on to describe little details I wished I didn't know. How he would sometimes check his phone late at night when he thought I was asleep. How he'd confided in her about struggles he felt he couldn't share at home. I'm not saying this to justify it, she wrote. But I want you to know he wasn't just being unfaithful for the thrill. He was lost, Allison. So was I. We thought we found a solution in each other, but it was a mistake. You were his real choice. The sting of those words made my stomach churn. His real choice. As if I should be grateful. As if the fact that he had chosen me in the end made any of this bearable. I didn't know whether to throw the letter away or cling to it, as evidence of this hidden part of my life. Evidence of the version of him that I had never seen, but that she had known so intimately. And then, in the final paragraph, she told me why she was writing now. She had moved on, she said. Found her own relationship. Someone who made her feel whole. She didn't want my husband anymore. She had no intention of disrupting my life, but she thought I deserved the truth. She even thanked me in a way for being the person he returned to. You're the one who keeps him grounded, she wrote. I believe he truly loves you in a way I'll never know. That's why I stepped back. That's why I stayed quiet until now. I sat there staring at the final lines, feeling like my heart had been ripped open. I'd loved him for over a decade. And yet here was a woman telling me things about him that I'd never known. This stranger had seen a side of my husband that I never had, held secrets that had been mine to carry without knowing. The betrayal felt fresh, as if it had just happened, as if I'd only just discovered the affair instead of learning about it years later, after it was supposedly over. I wanted to confront him, demand answers, yell and cry and ask him why. But in that moment, I felt strangely empty. The anger would come later, I knew. But for now, all I felt was a quiet devastation. A part of me wondered if I could forgive him, if I even wanted to. Because now that I knew, nothing would ever be the same. I sat with that letter in my hand for what felt like hours, reading and rereading each line, the words swirling around my mind like a storm that wouldn't settle. Questions, accusations, and regrets all tangled together in my head. It was as if Clara's letter had opened a door to a world I didn't want to step into. A place where my marriage, the very foundation of my life, was no longer solid ground. I suddenly felt like I didn't know my own husband, like I was living with a stranger who had kept his true self hidden away, sharing it with someone else, someone who was now urging me to understand him. It wasn't just her words. It was the certainty she seemed to have about him, the way she spoke about his struggles, his supposed loneliness. How could this stranger, this woman I'd never met, be so sure of her insights into the man I shared a life with? As if her brief affair had granted her some knowledge that I, his wife of over a decade, lacked. I hated the power that her words held over me, the influence she seemed to have over my perception of my own marriage. I thought back to those years. There were moments I could recall, small things that had seemed innocent then but now took on a different shade. The late nights he'd spent working, the distance in his eyes some days that I had assumed was just fatigue, or maybe the strain of work. There were times he seemed distracted, times when I asked him if something was wrong, if he needed to talk, but he would simply shake his head, brush it off as nothing important, just stress. I believed him. I trusted him. Now I felt foolish for all the times I'd accepted his reassurances. I kept thinking back to how I hadn't seen it, how I hadn't suspected a thing. This wasn't just an affair. It was a hidden version of him, a side he hadn't trusted me with, a part of himself he had shared with her. The betrayal wasn't just in the act but in the emotional intimacy they'd shared, the pieces of him she had seen that he'd kept from me. Hours passed and I still hadn't moved from the kitchen. I felt numb. My body ached with the weight of it all, as if the pain was sinking deeper and deeper into my bones. I could almost hear Clara's voice in my head, justifying what she had done, trying to convince me that it wasn't meaningless, that I should understand him better because of it. But how could I ever understand him now? He hadn't come to me, hadn't trusted me with his loneliness, his dissatisfaction, if that's even what it was. No, he'd turned to her, to someone outside our marriage. And here I was, left with the shards of her confessions, trying to piece together what my life had actually been during those years. That night, when he came home, I watched him closely. For the first time in years, I found myself looking at him as if he were a stranger. I noticed the subtle lines in his face, the way his hair had started to gray at the temples, things I had loved once, things that felt oddly unfamiliar now. I wondered if I'd ever truly known him, or if I'd just convinced myself that I did. He didn't notice me watching him, and maybe that hurt the most, that he was so oblivious to my pain, so unaware of the silent upheaval going on inside me. Part of me wanted to confront him right then, to shove that letter in his face and demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I studied him, waiting, watching for something, anything that would betray the man he really was. Over the next few days, I was like a ghost, moving through my life with a numbness I couldn't shake. I went through the motions, cooking, working, spending time with our friends, our family. But everything felt hollow, like a performance, because all I could think about was him and Clara. Their shared moments, the intimacy they'd had that I hadn't known about. My mind filled with images of them together, scenarios that played out in vivid detail, each one making the pain sharper, the betrayal more real. I went back to the letter almost every night, poring over her words, looking for any hidden meaning, some clue that would explain how this had happened without me knowing, without me feeling it. I even found myself obsessing over the language she used, the tenderness in her tone, the way she spoke about him with such fondness despite the hurt she had caused me. Did she still have feelings for him? Or was she simply trying to justify herself, to make herself feel less guilty by believing they had shared something more than just physical attraction? I lost track of time. Days blurred together and I grew quieter, more distant. Friends began to ask if I was okay, if something was wrong. I brushed them off, unable to explain the turmoil I was going through. The way I felt like my life was crumbling while I was helpless to stop it. Finally, one night I couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat across from him at dinner, watching him, trying to remember the love I had once felt, the comfort that had been so natural between us. But it was gone, replaced by a mixture of anger, sadness, and betrayal. I set my fork down, took a breath, and looked him in the eyes. "Who is Clara?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He froze, the color draining from his face. For a long moment he didn't say anything. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and guilt, and in that silence, I felt a confirmation of everything Clara's letter had implied. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked away, staring down at his hands as if they held the answer to a question he couldn't face. He began, but his voice broke and he looked at me, his eyes pleading. How did you find out? That was it. Not an apology, not an explanation. Just a question, as if it mattered how I had found out, as if the truth of what he'd done could be mitigated by ignorance. I felt a surge of anger, sharper than anything I'd ever felt, and I couldn't hold back anymore. She wrote me a letter, I said, my voice trembling with the weight of my anger. She told me everything. How you met her, how you spent time with her, how you told her things you couldn't tell me. How you chose her over me, even if only for a moment. He looked devastated, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. I watched him, waiting for him to say something, to explain, to give me a reason to believe that our life together hadn't been a lie. But he just sat there, guilt written across his face, unable or unwilling to say the words I needed to hear. In that moment I realized that maybe I didn't want to hear his explanations. Maybe nothing he could say would ever make this okay. I thought about all the years I had spent with him, the love and trust one had given him, the future I had envisioned with him. And now all of it felt tainted, spoiled by the memory of a woman I had never even met. That night I slept in the guest room. The bed felt cold and unfamiliar, but I preferred the emptiness to the thought of lying beside him, pretending everything was fine. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't know what the future would hold, or whether I could ever forgive him. But for the first time since reading Clara's letter, I felt a sense of strength, a realization that I didn't have to accept this, that I deserved more than the broken pieces he was offering me. In the morning, I left the house before he woke up. I needed time, space to think, to decide what I wanted. For now, all I knew was that my life had changed, that I had changed, and that nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, I moved through my life with a heavy heart, as if a weight had settled into my chest that I couldn't lift, no matter how hard I tried. Every part of my routine felt foreign, from the way I made breakfast to the way I went through my emails at work. Every task seemed tinted by this knowledge, this secret life I'd discovered so abruptly. I kept replaying his expression in my mind, the mixture of shock and shame in his eyes, the way his shoulders had slumped under the weight of my question. But I didn't feel pity. Instead, I felt an ache that hadn't gone away since reading that letter, an ache that seemed to deepen with every memory. During my lunch breaks, I would sometimes scroll back through old photos on my phone, moments from happier days. There were pictures of us on vacations, smiles from Christmas mornings, silly selfies from quiet Sunday afternoons at home. I studied those photos, trying to remember how I had felt in those moments, but it was almost impossible. I felt like a stranger looking at someone else's life. My husband's face in those photos seemed almost unfamiliar now, as if it was a different person smiling back at me. And maybe it was. Maybe that man, the one who had held me close and whispered promises of forever, was just an illusion. One day, about a week after the confrontation, I called in sick to work. The idea of sitting at my desk pretending to focus felt unbearable. Instead, I spent the day at a park we used to go to together, a quiet place where we'd sometimes go on weekends just to walk and talk. I sat on a bench there watching other couples walk by, holding hands, laughing together. I wondered if any of them had secrets, if any of them were hiding pieces of themselves from each other like he had from me. The thought made my stomach turn. I had once believed we were that couple, the one that had it all figured out, who could weather any storm together. Now it seemed naive, like a fantasy I'd outgrown. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was fragile, fleeting, but in that moment, I understood something important. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't rewrite the past. But I had a choice to make about my future. I could continue to live in this pain, to let it consume me, or I could take a step forward, even if I didn't know where that step would lead. That night, I returned home with a decision weighing on my heart. I found him in the living room, sitting alone in the dim light, looking more tired and worn than I had ever seen him. His head was in his hands, and for a moment I just watched him, trying to reconcile this broken version of him with the man I had married. I cleared my throat and he looked up, his eyes filled with that same mixture of guilt and sadness. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. He nodded slowly, his expression resigned, as if he had been waiting for this moment, dreading it. "I've thought about what happened," I began, choosing my words carefully. "And I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest. No more hiding, no more excuses. I need to understand why." He took a deep breath and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak. His voice low and filled with a raw vulnerability I had never heard before. He told me about that time in his life, about how he had felt lost and overwhelmed, how he had started to question everything. His career, his marriage, even his own identity. He admitted that he had kept it all bottled up, afraid to burden me, afraid to show weakness. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But really I was just avoiding my own pain. And when I met her, I felt seen in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. She understood that part of me, the part I tried to hide, even from myself." His words stung, but I listened, forcing myself to take it all in, to hear his side of things. He spoke about how he had known, even while it was happening, that it was wrong, that he was betraying everything we had built together. And yet he hadn't stopped. He had continued, seeking comfort in the arms of a stranger instead of confronting the issues in our own marriage. "I was a coward," he said, looking at me with eyes that seemed older, more haunted than I remembered. "I thought I could have it both ways, that I could find some escape and still come back to you like nothing had happened. But I was wrong. And I've regretted it every day since." For a long time we sat in silence. His confession, as raw and painful as it was, gave me some semblance of clarity. I could see the brokenness in him, the flaws and insecurities he had tried to bury, and I realized that his betrayal hadn't just been a rejection of me. It had been a rejection of himself, of the parts of him he hadn't known how to confront. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. I still felt the weight of his choices, the sting of his betrayal, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive him. I didn't know if I wanted to. All I knew was that I needed time to sort through my feelings, to decide what I truly wanted. "I need space," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I can't keep living like this, pretending everything is okay. I need time to figure out what I want, to decide if I can ever trust you again." He nodded, his expression filled with understanding and regret. "I'll give you whatever you need," he said, his voice soft, almost defeated. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." With that, I got up and went to the bedroom, closing the door behind me. I sat on the bed, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. I had taken a step, set a boundary, but I knew that the path ahead would be long and uncertain. I had no idea if our marriage could survive this, if I could ever look at him the same way again. But for the first time since reading Clara's letter, I felt a glimmer of hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward with or without him. The next few weeks became a test of endurance. I moved through my days in a sort of numb haze, half engaged with the life around me but mostly retreating inward, trying to make sense of my feelings and the path I now faced. I told him I needed space, but even that was complicated. We shared a home, a life, and the routines we'd built together became painful reminders of the love I wasn't sure existed anymore. He respected my request for distance in a way that surprised me, almost as if he was afraid to push me any further away. He took over the cooking, left for work earlier than usual, and when he came home, spent his evenings on the couch or in the study. I would sometimes find him sitting there in the dark, looking at an old photo of us on his desk, his expression one of quiet remorse. And though he didn't say anything, his silence often spoke louder than words. I avoided him as much as I could. I spent long hours outside, walking through the neighborhood, or driving out to the nearby coast where I could just sit by the water, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks. The ocean had always been my place of refuge, a place where I felt connected to something larger than myself. But even here I found little comfort. Instead, I found myself replaying memories, turning over every moment we had shared, searching for signs I'd missed, for clues that might explain how he could have gone so far without me realizing it. One evening I stayed at the beach longer than I intended, watching the sunset until the sky faded into darkness. The cold air bit at my skin, But I didn't move, letting the chill seep in as if it could numb the ache inside me. I thought about the letter again, Clara's words echoing in my mind like an unending loop. I thought about the man I thought I had married, the man she had known, and the man who had confessed his regret to me. They all felt like different people, fragments of a whole that no longer made sense. Eventually, I decided I couldn't keep isolating myself, that I needed to confide in someone. My closest friend, Sarah, had known me longer than anyone. She had been there when we first started dating, had been my maid of honor at our wedding. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. I called her that night, my voice trembling as I explained everything, the affair, the letter, my confusion and pain. There was a long silence on the other end before she finally spoke. "Allison," she said gently, "you don't have to make any decisions right now. You've been through something traumatic. Give yourself permission to feel everything without judgment." Her words felt like a balm to my fractured heart. I had been trying so hard to make sense of it all, to find some kind of answer, but maybe that was impossible. Maybe there was no answer, only pain, and healing would take time. Over the next few days, I leaned on Sarah's support more than I ever had before. She listened without judgment, offering advice when I asked but never pushing me in one direction or another. With her help, I began to see my emotions with a little more clarity. I began to realize that the love I felt for him hadn't disappeared. It was buried beneath layers of anger and betrayal, twisted into something unfamiliar but still there, like a faint ember under the ashes. And as the days turned into weeks, a strange thing happened. Little by little, I began to feel a flicker of curiosity about his struggles, the pain he had mentioned but never shared with me. I found myself wondering if there was truth in his claim of being lost, if his affair with Clara had been a symptom of something deeper, something we had both neglected. It was a painful thought to realize that maybe we had both failed each other in some way, that perhaps my own focus on keeping everything in our life perfect had blinded me to his needs, his own silent cries for help. One night, after weeks of silence between us, I found him sitting in the study again, staring at that same photo. The sight of him there looking so broken stirred something in me. I hesitated in the doorway, my heart pounding. And before I knew it, the words were spilling out. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked softly, the pain evident in my voice. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy?" He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected me to initiate the conversation. His gaze softened, and he let out a heavy sigh. "I didn't know how," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "You've always been so strong, so certain, and I guess I didn't want you to see me as weak. I thought I could handle it on my own, that if I just pushed through I'd come out the other side. But I was wrong. And I know that now." We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us sure where to go from here. But something had shifted. The wall between us, though still there, didn't feel as insurmountable as it once had. For the first time since Clara's letter, I felt like we were on the same side of this pain, sharing it instead of letting it divide us. I wasn't ready to forgive him yet, wasn't sure if I ever would be, but I could see that he was trying, that he was willing to face the darkness he had kept hidden for so long. Over the following months, we began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding. It was a painful process, full of moments where I wanted to turn away, to leave the past behind and start fresh without him. There were days when the anger resurfaced, burning hot and uncontrollable. Days when I would lash out, reminding him of everything he had destroyed, of the trust he had shattered. And yet, through it all, he stayed. He didn't walk away, didn't retreat into his silence as he once had. Instead, he listened, took my anger, my grief, my pain, and held it with me, acknowledging it instead of hiding from it. We went to therapy together, a place where we could safely unpack the pieces of our broken relationship, where we could confront the wounds we had both inflicted and received. It was there, in that quiet, sterile room, that I began to see him not as the man who had betrayed me, but as a flawed, vulnerable human being, struggling in his own way. It didn't make his actions any less hurtful, but it did help me understand the depth of his remorse, the regret that had been eating away at him long before Clara's letter arrived. There were no grand gestures, no moments of sudden clarity or miraculous healing. Instead, there was a slow, gradual softening of my heart, a tiny crack in the armor I had built around myself. I began to open up to him again, little by little, sharing my own fears, my own insecurities. And he listened, truly listened, in a way he hadn't before. One evening, several months after the letter had arrived, I found myself looking at him and feeling something I hadn't expected: gratitude. It was a fragile, tentative feeling, and it took me by surprise. But as I looked at him, at the man who had caused me so much pain but who had also stayed, who had fought for us even when I wasn't sure I wanted him to, I realized that I was grateful. Grateful for the pain that had forced us to confront our flaws, to see each other as we truly were, without the illusions that had once kept us apart. Rebuilding our marriage wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting what had happened. It was about learning to live with the scars, to carry the weight of our shared mistakes while moving forward together. There would always be a part of me that remembered the betrayal, that felt the sting of Clara's letter. But I also knew that our love had survived something I once thought would destroy it. As I held his hand that night, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine, I understood that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a choice I would have to make every day. It would be a journey, a continuous act of grace, both for him and for myself. And so we began again, two imperfect people, bound by love and hurt, learning to trust each other anew. As we rebuilt our lives, I found that the process was far from linear. Some days it felt like we were making progress, like the pieces of our life were finally coming together into something new, something that, while different from what we had before, could still be beautiful. Other days, though, the memories of his betrayal would creep back in, unbidden and relentless. I would find myself back in that place of anger and hurt, and I would question why I had chosen to stay, why I had decided to give us this second chance. I knew that healing wasn't a straight line, but I hadn't expected just how deep those setbacks could cut. One evening, while we were sitting together in the living room, a familiar doubt washed over me. It was triggered by something simple, a song on the radio that reminded me of the year he'd been unfaithful. My chest tightened, the unspoken question weighing heavily on me again. Why didn't you come to me? I stared at the floor, barely aware that I'd let out a sigh. He must have noticed my change in mood because he reached out, gently touching my arm. You okay? He asked softly, his eyes filled with a familiar worry. I hesitated, feeling the familiar tug-of-war inside me. Part of me wanted to push him away, to retreat into my own pain, to wall myself off from him and the memory of what he'd done. But I'd promised myself that if I was going to give us a real chance, I had to learn to be vulnerable again, even if it hurt. So I nodded, slowly lifting my gaze to meet his. I still wonder why, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. I still don't understand how we got here. Why you couldn't have just told me that you were hurting. He swallowed, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he took a deep breath, and I could see the weight of his own guilt and regret etched into his expression. I think about that every day, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you. I was scared. I didn't know how to talk about it, or even how to admit it to myself. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. I convinced myself that you were happy, and I didn't want to disrupt that. I looked down, processing his words, feeling the familiar sting of frustration. His reasoning felt so incomplete, so insufficient, yet I could also sense the truth in it. We'd both played roles in our marriage that hadn't left room for vulnerability. He had buried his struggles, afraid to appear weak, while I had done my best to hold everything together, to make our life look perfect to the outside world. I realized then that maybe I too had missed chances to truly connect with him, moments where I could have encouraged him to open up instead of assuming everything was fine. The realization left me feeling both relieved and deeply unsettled. I guess I wasn't listening as much as I thought I was, I admitted, feeling a pang of guilt that I hadn't expected. I thought I was being a good partner, but maybe I wasn't asking you what you needed. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle, as if he were afraid I might pull away. Allison, you were an amazing wife. You still are. None of this is your fault. I nodded, grateful for his words, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more I needed to understand. His affair had forced me to confront parts of our marriage I hadn't wanted to look at, parts of myself I hadn't wanted to see. We'd both been complicit, in ways I was only beginning to comprehend, in creating a marriage where honesty had somehow slipped through the cracks. I knew that moving forward would require both of us to change, to break down the barriers we had built between us. In the months that followed, we made a commitment to each other. A silent vow to not only rebuild our trust but to redefine our relationship, to make space for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. We began to have deeper conversations, ones that were often painful but necessary. We talked about our fears, our regrets, our desires, things we hadn't dared to bring up before. I started sharing parts of myself I'd kept hidden, my own insecurities, the ways I had sometimes felt alone despite being together. I opened up about how much it had hurt that he hadn't turned to me, that he had chosen someone else to confide in. And he listened, truly listened, absorbing every word without defensiveness or denial. For the first time in years, I felt like he was seeing me, the real me, and I was beginning to see him in the same way. There were still days when I doubted, when the pain resurfaced and I questioned whether we were strong enough to survive this. But each time he met me where I was, offering patience and understanding, proving that he was willing to put in the work, no matter how difficult it might be. I could see the effort he was making, the small ways he was trying to rebuild my trust, texting me throughout the day to check in, inviting me to join him on errands or outings, finding little ways to reassure me that I was and would always be his priority. It was a fragile piece, one that required daily care and attention, like a delicate flower that had just begun to bloom. But with each passing day, I felt my heart soften a little more, my trust inching its way back, not fully restored but healing slowly, steadily. One evening after a long day, we found ourselves sitting outside under the stars, a glass of wine in each of our hands. The silence between us was comfortable, and I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a long time. "Do you think we'll be okay?" I asked him, voicing the question that had lingered in the back of my mind for so long. He looked at me, his gaze filled with a quiet resolve. "I hope so," he replied, his voice gentle. "But even if we're not, I know I'll never stop trying." Those words, simple as they were, filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. They weren't a promise of perfection, nor an assurance that everything would go back to how it had been. They were a commitment, a testament to the work we had both put in, the scars we had both carried. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see him and our marriage with a different kind of clarity. We had both changed, both been forced to face parts of ourselves that were difficult and uncomfortable. And while the pain of his betrayal would never fully disappear, I could feel it losing its grip on me, its sharp edges softening into something less destructive, something that no longer controlled my every thought. In time, I found myself smiling again, laughing, even feeling a sense of lightness I hadn't thought possible. I discovered a new kind of love between us, one that was built not on illusions or ideals but on resilience, on the raw, imperfect truth of who we were. And while it wasn't the fairy tale I had once envisioned, it was real, and it was ours. Looking back, I sometimes wondered if Clara's letter, painful as it had been, had actually saved us. It had shattered my world, forced me to confront a darkness I hadn't wanted to see. But in doing so, it had also led us to something deeper, something more honest. We had been broken, but in that breaking we had found a way to rebuild, not just our marriage but ourselves. One night, long after the hurt had faded into something manageable, I found that letter tucked away in a drawer, a relic of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of everything it had brought into my life, pain, heartbreak, but also growth and transformation. I thought about throwing it away, letting go of that final piece of the past. But in the end, I decided to keep it, not as a reminder of the betrayal, but as a symbol of the journey we had taken, of the love we had rebuilt from the ashes. And in that moment I felt a strange sense of gratitude, a peace that came not from forgetting the past, but from knowing that we had faced it together, and somehow, despite everything, we had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and still against all odds in love. As time passed, the weight of Clara's letter faded from an immediate pain to a distant ache, a reminder of a fracture that had healed, but left a scar. Some days I barely thought of it. Other days it came back like an old wound throbbing with the weather, reminding me of the ordeal we had survived. The letter remained hidden in the drawer, untouched but not forgotten, a quiet testament to both the pain and the resilience we had found in each other. But as much as we had moved forward, the aftershocks still appeared unexpectedly, and one such moment caught me off guard. One Saturday morning, as we were clearing out the attic to donate some old clothes and items, I came across a box of our old letters and photos. It was from the early years of our relationship, a collection of memories we'd both kept over the years. I lifted the lid, and there they were. Photos from our first trip to the mountains, postcards we had sent each other from different trips, and the notes he used to leave for me around the house. Flipping through them, I felt a rush of memories flood back, a mixture of nostalgia and sadness, knowing that while these moments were real, they were from a time before I'd learned about his infidelity. There was a part of me that grieved for that innocent version of us, the one that had believed love alone could sustain us, that trust was unbreakable. I felt his presence beside me, watching as I sorted through the photos, and I saw him reach for a small, crumpled note near the bottom of the box. He opened it, smiling faintly. "Do you remember this?" he asked, holding up the little note with my handwriting. It was from years ago, a simple message I'd left for him one morning. "Can't wait for date night tonight. Love you more than you'll ever know." I smiled, though a pang of sadness touched my heart. "I remember," I said softly, my voice catching. It was strange, bittersweet to be reminded of those years, of the love that had seemed so simple, so effortless. We sat there in silence for a moment, surrounded by fragments of our life together, before he finally spoke. "I want to be that man again," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The one who deserves those notes, who lives up to what we used to have." I looked at him, seeing the rawness in his eyes, the longing for a past that no longer existed. And though the hurt was still there, I realized I wanted to be that person too. The woman who could love without reservation, who could leave notes filled with simple, hopeful words. It was a moment of clarity, one that reminded me why I'd stayed, why I'd fought to rebuild our marriage despite everything. Because while the past had its hold on us, there was also something powerful in what we were creating now. A love that had been tested, one that had learned to survive. Over the next few months, our relationship continued to transform. The deep conversations we'd begun in therapy now found their way into our daily life, and it wasn't just about us anymore. We spoke of our goals, our dreams, and what we wanted the next chapter to look like. We began to plan trips we'd never taken, experiences we had always put off. We found new traditions like going for long drives on Sunday afternoons, exploring small towns nearby, or sharing our thoughts while sitting under the stars. Each small step helped us create a new story, one that wasn't haunted by the shadows of betrayal, but built on the strength of resilience. But even as we moved forward, I realized there were parts of me that needed healing on my own. I had always defined myself through our marriage, through the life we had built together. But the affair had forced me to confront a different reality, to ask myself who I was outside of being his wife.